There are things that happen on night duty that never make it into the report. Not because they are classified, not because the soldier involved is covering something up or protecting someone or filing the corners of the truth to make it fit a neater shape, but because there is a category of experience that the standard incident report form was simply never designed to hold. The boxes on that form ask for time, location, nature of incident, action taken, outcome. They do not ask for what it felt like to stand completely still in the East Garden of Buckingham Palace at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning watching something move through the darkness that your 12 years of training could not immediately name. Corporal James Whitfield of the Coldstream Guard stood in that garden on a Tuesday night in October and did something that his regiment's protocol did not technically authorize and did not technically forbid. He waited. He watched. He did not reach for his radio. He did not call out. He did not advance. He simply stood in the shadow of the garden wall and watched the figure move. And he made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that he has spent considerably longer than 4 seconds thinking about since. That decision and what it revealed is what this story is about. Start with what you think you know when you think you know everything. You have seen the Royal Guards. Everyone has seen the Royal Guards. You have seen them outside the palace in their red tunics and their bearskin caps, standing with a stillness that seems less like discipline and more like a different relationship with time altogether. You have seen the tourists approach them. You have seen the photographs taken at approximately 4 inches from a human face that is committed to expressing nothing. You have seen the changing of the guard, the synchronized movement, the band, the whole carefully choreographed spectacle of it. And if someone asked you what those guards do at night, you would probably say something like, the same thing but in the dark, standing at posts, being still, being watched by nobody because there is nobody left to watch. This is not what they do at night. What they do at night is considerably more operational, considerably more procedurally complex, and considerably more psychologically demanding than the daytime ceremonial duties that the public observes and photographs and occasionally tries to make blink. The night is when the ceremony falls away entirely, and what is left is a working security operation, protecting one of the most symbolically significant buildings in the world in a city that does not fully sleep and does not fully stop producing threats both real and imagined. Night patrol at Buckingham Palace is divided into sectors. Each sector has a timing. Each timing has a checkpoint. Each checkpoint has a protocol. And each protocol exists because at some point in the history of this institution, someone either failed to follow it or followed it perfectly and something still went wrong. And the protocol was written or rewritten in the aftermath of that failure in the particular careful language of people who never want to write that protocol again. Whitfield knew every sector. He knew every timing. He had walked the East Garden Patrol route so many times that his body knew the uneven flagstone near the 3rd ornamental hedge before his eyes registered it in the dark. He knew the sound the garden made in October wind, the particular way the trees moved differently from the way an animal or a person moved through them, the specific quality of silence that meant the grounds were empty versus the slightly different quality of silence that meant they were not. He had 12 years to learn the difference. On that Tuesday in October, the silence told him something was in the garden that should not be there. Before you understand what Whitfield saw, you need to understand what Whitfield was. He was not by any measure that Hollywood would recognize a remarkable soldier. He was not the largest man in his regiment. He was not the most decorated. He had served in 2 overseas deployments and come home from both of them with no injuries and no citations for conspicuous gallantry and no stories that began with the phrase, "We were completely surrounded." He had done his job. He had done it well. He had done it with the particular unglamorous consistency that the British Army depends on and almost never publicly celebrates, because consistent competence does not make for compelling ceremony. What Whitfield had, And what the Coldstream guards had spent 12 years refining in him was judgment. Not instinct, judgment. The difference matters. Instinct is fast and animal and sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong. Judgment is instinct that has been educated, that has been forced to sit down with experience and argue until they reach a conclusion that both can defend. Judgment is what you develop when you have spent enough time in enough situations where the wrong call has consequences that cannot be undone. Whitfield had been wrong twice in 12 years, not catastrophically, not in ways that ended careers or changed outcomes in any lasting sense, but wrong enough to remember. Wrong enough that when he stood in the East Garden at 2:20 in the morning and felt the quality of the silence shift, he did not immediately reach for the radio and report a possible intruder in Sector 4. He waited. He wanted to be right before he spoke. This is not what the protocol said to do. The protocol said to report immediately, confirm later, escalate without hesitation. The protocol had been written by people who understood that in a security environment, the cost of a false alarm is embarrassment, and the cost of a missed threat is something the protocol writers did not want to put into words. Whitfield knew the protocol. He had written sections of the updated version himself. He set it aside for 4 seconds that felt considerably longer, and he watched. Here is what the East Garden of Buckingham Palace looks like at 2:20 on an October morning. It looks like something that was designed in daylight and has never entirely made peace with the dark. The ornamental hedges that seem perfectly proportioned and pleasantly architectural in the afternoon become, at 2 in the morning, a series of large, irregular shapes that the eye keeps trying to resolve into something it recognizes. The gravel paths that are pale and clear in daylight become suggestions, outlines, the memory of paths rather than paths themselves. The trees move in the October wind with a sound that is not quite like any other sound, not mechanical, not animal, not fully natural, something in between. And through all of this, at the far end of the garden near the wall that separates the grounds from the south wing, something was moving. Whitfield's first reading was maintenance. Someone from the grounds team working late or working early, doing the kind of work that happens before the palace wakes up. This was not an unreasonable reading. Maintenance staff did work night hours. Grounds teams did sometimes operate in the pre-dawn window. It happened. But maintenance staff moved differently. They moved with the directional purpose of people who knew where they were going and needed to get there efficiently. They carried things. They left traces, the hum of equipment, the specific footfall of someone carrying weight. And they were logged. Every non-security presence on the grounds after midnight was logged, and Whitfield had seen the log for that night before he started his patrol. It had 2 names on it, both of them in the north wing. Both of them signed in through the staff entrance 2 hours ago. Whatever was in the East Garden was not on the log. His second reading was unauthorized access. A journalist, perhaps, or a photographer, or one of the deeply committed obsessives who periodically tested the palace's perimeter not out of malice, but out of a compulsion that Whitfield had never fully understood and had stopped trying to. These people existed. The security services had a name for them that was not complimentary. They came over walls or through gaps that the security reviews kept identifying, and the budget kept prioritizing, and the contractors kept not quite fixing in time for the next review. They came in and they took their photographs in the dark, and they posted them online with captions about how easy it had been. And then there were meetings, and then there were reports, and then the gaps got fixed until the next gap appeared. Unauthorized access meant radio. Unauthorized access meant protocol, escalation, containment. Unauthorized access meant that the 4 seconds of waiting were already over, and what came next was the scripted response that 12 years of training had made automatic. Whitfield's hand moved toward the radio. And then the figure stopped. It did not freeze the way a person freezes when they hear a sound behind them and suspect they have been seen. It stopped with the quality of someone who had arrived somewhere, who had come to a specific place for a specific reason and was now at that place and settling into it. And it stood very still, and it looked at the wall. There is something that happens in security work that the training manuals acknowledge in one paragraph, and then move past as though the acknowledgement is enough. It is the moment when the threat you have been trained to identify declines to behave like a threat. Not because it is hiding, not because it is clever, but because it simply is not what your training was written to handle. And in that gap between what your training expects and what you are actually looking at, something very strange happens to a highly trained mind. It does not go blank. It does not panic. It is something almost more unsettling than either of those things. It asks a question it was not expecting to ask. Whitfield's question, standing in the shadow of the garden wall at 22 minutes past 2 in the morning, watching a figure stand completely still and look at a wall with what he could only describe later as intention, was this: what are you doing here? Not who are you? Not how did you get in? Those were protocol questions, confrontation questions, the first line of the scripted response. This was different. This was genuine curiosity arriving in the middle of a security assessment like an uninvited guest who turns out to know everyone in the room. What are you doing here? The figure was not large. Whitfield registered this without quite deciding to. Medium height, dressed in dark clothing that was not tactical, not the specific dark of someone who had thought about being invisible, just the ordinary dark of someone who had dressed for a cold night and not thought about visibility at all. No bag, no equipment, no camera that Whitfield could see. Moving with a familiarity that was almost the most unsettling thing about the whole situation. Not the furtive familiarity of someone who has learned a space in order to exploit it. The easy familiarity of someone who has simply been here before, many times. In the specific unhurried way of someone for whom this place holds something personal rather than tactical. The figure reached out and touched the wall. Just touched it, palm flat against the old stone, the way you touch a wall when you are not checking its structural integrity or looking for a handhold but simply making contact with something. The way you touch a wall when the wall means something to you. Whitfield stood very still and felt the quality of the situation change in a way he could not immediately account for. Here is something about Buckingham Palace that is not on the tour. The East Garden wall that Whitfield was watching this figure touch is not the original wall. That sentence sounds simple and turns out to be anything, but because the question of what counts as original at a building that has been rebuilt, expanded, refaced, and remodeled across 4 centuries of changing monarchs and changing tastes and changing ideas about what a palace should look like, is a question that the palace's own historians approach with considerable care. But the specific section of wall at the south end of the East Garden, the section the figure had walked to with the purposeful calm of someone following a route they knew by heart, contains within its current facing a section of original garden boundary that dates to the period before the building became a royal residence at all. When Buckingham House, as it was then, became the property of George III in 1762, the garden boundary was incorporated into the expanded grounds. The stone did not move. The facing changed around it. The rest of the garden was redesigned twice and then redesigned again, and the wall stayed. There are people who know this. Not many. Mostly architectural historians and a small number of palace staff who have been there long enough to have absorbed the building's layered biography, the way you absorb anything you live alongside for long enough. You stop seeing it as a single thing and start seeing it as a conversation between different centuries conducted in stone and mortar, and the specific decisions of people who are no longer alive to explain them. Whitfield did not know this at 22 minutes past 2 in the morning. He found it out later, when the situation had resolved itself, and he was sitting in an office on the north side of the building drinking tea that had gone slightly cold and listening to someone explain, in the careful, precise language of a person who has explained this before but not often, exactly who the figure in the East Garden was, and why they were there, and why there was, it turned out. A notation in a file that Whitfield's security clearance did not cover, which meant the figure should have been on his log, and was not because of an administrative oversight that 3 separate people would describe to him in the following week as regrettable. But that is later. At 22 minutes past 2, Whitfield knew none of this. What he knew was that his hand was still near his radio, and that something was stopping him from picking it up, and that the something was not fear and was not protocol failure, and was not any of the things that a subsequent review board might look for if this situation went in a direction that required a review board. The something was this: the figure at the wall was grieving. Whitfield had seen grief in enough forms to recognize it across a dark garden. He had seen it in the specific stillness of it, in the way the figure's shoulders carried themselves, in the quality of the contact between the palm and the stone. You do not touch a wall like that unless the wall is a marker, unless you have come to this place, because this place holds something you cannot carry with you and cannot leave behind. He lowered his hand from the radio. What he did next was not in the protocol. The protocol, as previously established, was written by people who had thought carefully about threats and responses and escalation pathways, and the specific chain of decisions that converts an anomaly in a security environment into a managed and documented outcome. The protocol was good. Whitfield respected it. He had contributed to it. The protocol had not considered the possibility that the anomaly in the security environment might need, before anything else, to be left alone for a moment. Whitfield stepped back, not retreating, not abandoning his post or his responsibility or the 12 years of judgment that the Coldstream Guards had invested in him, simply creating space, moving to a position from which he could still see the figure clearly, could still intervene in seconds if the situation required intervention, but where his presence was less immediate, less like a confrontation waiting to begin and more like a witness. He stood there for 4 minutes. He knows it was 4 minutes because he checked his watch when he stepped back and checked it again when the figure finally moved away from the wall. And the difference between those 2 times was 4 minutes that felt, in the particular elastic way that time behaves in the dark and the quiet, considerably longer. During those 4 minutes, the figure did not move significantly. They stood at the wall. They kept their palm against the stone. Once, they bowed their head in the specific way that people bow their heads when they are talking to someone who is no longer there to hear it. Once, they looked up at the sky in the equally specific way that people look up at the sky when they have run out of words and are waiting for the sky to suggest something. Then they straightened. They stood for another moment with their hand still on the wall, and then they removed it, deliberately. The way you remove your hand from something when you are ready to leave, but not entirely ready to leave. They turned and they walked back across the garden toward the south wing entrance with the same unhurried familiarity they had arrived with. Whitfield watched them go. Then he completed his patrol. Then he finished his shift. Then he sat in the office on the north side and drank the cold tea and listened to the explanation. The figure in the east garden was a woman named Margaret Howell. She was 63 years old. She had worked at the palace for 31 years, the last 19 of them as a senior member of the curatorial staff responsible for the royal collection, which is to say responsible for some of the most significant works of art and historical artifacts in the world, and which is also to say responsible for knowing the palace not as a building you work in, but as a document you spend your career learning to read. Her husband, a man named David, had worked at the palace for 24 years. He had been part of the grounds team. He had known the East Garden the way Whitfield knew his patrol route, in the body, without having to think about it. He had known the South Wall specifically, because he had spent 3 separate seasons working on the drainage project that ran along its base. A project that had taken longer than anyone planned for the specific unglamorous reasons that projects at historic buildings always take longer than anyone plans for, and that he had, during those 3 seasons, developed a relationship with that particular section of wall that his colleagues thought was slightly eccentric, and that Margaret had understood perfectly. David Howell had died 14 months before the October night, when Whitfield watched Margaret stand at the wall with her palm against the stone. She had come back to the garden 6 times since his death, always at night, always with permission from the palace's head of security, who had known both her and David for over 20 years, and who had authorized her access through a channel that had not, due to the administrative failure that 3 separate people would describe as regrettable, communicated correctly with the night patrol log. She came because this was where David had spent 3 seasons of his working life doing something he found genuinely absorbing. She came because the wall was the closest thing available to a place that held him in the way that places hold people who are gone. She came because grief, as Whitfield had recognized from 20 meters away across a dark garden, does not operate on a schedule and does not always have somewhere appropriate to go. And sometimes the most it can do is put its palm against a stone wall at 2 in the morning and stand there for 4 minutes saying the things that cannot be said out loud to the general air and the October wind and the particular section of 18th century boundary stone that a man named David once spent 3 seasons getting to know. Whitfield listened to all of this. He drank the cold tea. He said very little because there was very little to say that the situation had not already said with considerably more precision than he could manage. Then he went home, and he wrote in his personal notebook rather than in the official incident log 1 sentence about that night. He has not made that sentence public. This story does not contain it. Some things belong to the person who wrote them. What Whitfield filed in the official report for that shift was an entry that read, East Garden, Sector 402, 19-02-26, authorized access confirmed, no incident. This was accurate. The access was authorized. There was no incident. The fact that the authorization had not been visible to him at the time of the patrol was not his error to document and not his finding to report. He had confirmed it after the fact in the office with the cold tea and the careful explanation. The report reflected what had been true. It simply did not reflect, could not reflect, the 4 minutes in the middle of it that had required him to make a decision that no protocol had written instructions for. That decision and the 4 minutes it protected cost nothing. No security was compromised. No procedure was ultimately violated. No threat materialized into anything that required the escalated response that 12 years of training had prepared him to deliver. What it produced instead, at a cost of 4 minutes and 1 lowered hand, was a woman standing at a wall in the dark being allowed to do what she had come to do without being interrupted by the machinery of institutional security. And it's entirely reasonable, entirely insufficient, entirely necessary inability to account for grief. Whitfield has thought about this since. He thinks about it in the specific way that soldiers think about the decisions that didn't become incidents, the calls that went right not because of what happened, but because of what didn't, the moments that never made it into the debrief, because there was nothing to debrief, and yet somehow stayed in the memory longer than the things that did. He thinks about what would have happened if he had reached for the radio in that 4-second window before he decided not to. He thinks about the escalation that would have followed, the lights, the additional personnel, the contained and managed and thoroughly documented interruption of a 63-year-old woman standing quietly at a wall, doing the most private thing a person can do in a public place at 2 in the morning. He thinks about whether the outcome would have been called correct. By the protocol, it would have been. By the review board, if there had been a review board, it would have been. By every reasonable standard of operational security in a sensitive environment, it would have been. And he thinks about how it would have also been wrong in a way that none of those standards were designed to measure. Here is what the Coldstream Guards will tell you about night patrol at Buckingham Palace if you ask them in the right way, in the way that produces honest answers rather than official ones. They will tell you that the night is different from the day in ways that go beyond the obvious. They will tell you that the palace at night is a different building than the palace in daylight, not metaphorically but functionally, that the relationship between a guard and the space they are protecting changes when the public is gone, and the ceremony is gone, and what is left is the building itself, and the specific quality of quiet that settles over it after midnight. They will tell you that night patrol teaches you things about the place that day duty cannot, that you come to know a building differently when you have walked its grounds in every weather at every hour, with no one watching and no performance required. They will tell you, if they trust you enough, that this knowledge is sometimes stranger than training prepared them for, that the palace holds more than its official history accounts for, that a building which has been continuously inhabited and continuously significant for that length of time accumulates something, not a ghost story presence, not anything that would embarrass a grown adult professional to say out loud, but something, a weight of human event, a density of things that happened here and left a trace that is not visible in daylight but becomes, in the particular silence of the night patrol, almost something you can navigate by. Whitfield would probably not use those words. He is precise in his language in the way that 12 years of report writing makes a person precise. He would say something more careful, more operational, more defensible to a review board. But he would not entirely disagree with them either. What he saw in the East Garden on that October night was not a ghost. It was not a security threat. It was not an incident. It was a woman and a wall and 4 minutes of the kind of grief that has nowhere else to go at 2 in the morning. It was something the palace had been holding for her without being asked to, the way old buildings hold things, not deliberately, not tenderly, just by being old and present and made of stone that has outlasted the people who knew it. The protocol was not written for this. The protocol was written for threats. And the most important thing Whitfield did that night was recognize, in the 4 seconds before he reached for his radio, that what he was looking at was not a threat. It was the opposite of a threat. It was the most human thing he had seen in 12 years of guarding a building that the world watches for its ceremony and almost never thinks about for its quiet. There are now a small number of additional lines in the night patrol protocol for the East Garden. They are not dramatic. They do not reference the specific incident that prompted them. They simply build in a confirmation step, a check against the authorized access log, a 2-minute assessment window before escalation is initiated, a recognition that the category of authorized non-security presence includes people whose authorization may not always travel correctly through the administrative systems that are supposed to carry it. 3 separate people described the original oversight as regrettable. The protocol revision does not use the word regrettable. It uses operational language. It says what to do. It does not say why. Whitfield knows why. He was in the office with the cold tea when the why was explained. He carries the why in the way that soldiers carry the things that didn't become incidents, quietly, without ceremony, in the personal notebook rather than the official log. Margaret Howell still works at the palace. She is 64 now. She has not returned to the East Garden at night since the October that Whitfield watched her from the shadow of the garden wall. Not because she is no longer welcome to, but because at some point in the months that followed, she told the head of security that she thought she had done what she needed to do there, and that she thought David would have found the whole situation, the night visits, the administrative confusion, the cold tea, the careful explanation, mildly ridiculous, and that she thought he was probably right. She said this with the specific quality of warmth that people have when they talk about someone they have lost and have also, slowly and painfully, and without ever fully finishing, learned to carry. The head of security, who had known both of them for over 20 years, said that David had in fact been consistently mildly ridiculous about most things, and that this was one of the things everyone who worked with him had found most valuable about him. This conversation also does not appear in any official record. So here is what you know now that you did not know when you started reading. You know that Corporal James Whitfield of the Coldstream Guards stood in the East Garden of Buckingham Palace at 20 minutes past 2 on an October morning, and saw something that his protocol could not name, and his training could not categorize, and his 12 years of judgment looked at for 4 seconds, and correctly identified as something that needed to be left alone. You know that what he was looking at was a woman named Margaret Howell, 63 years old, 31 years of service, standing at a section of garden wall that her husband had spent 3 seasons of his working life getting to know. You know that her husband's name was David. You know that he had been dead for 14 months. You know that she had come back 6 times because the wall was the closest thing available to a place that held him. You know that Whitfield lowered his hand from the radio and stepped back and stood in the shadow of the garden wall for 4 minutes watching a person grieve, and that this decision was not in the protocol and was not authorized, and was also completely correct in the way that some things are correct that no protocol has been written to describe. You know that the official report for that shift read, "Authorized access confirmed, no incident." You know this was true. You know it was also, by the measure of what actually happened in those 4 minutes, a significant understatement. You know that the protocol was revised. You know that 3 people called the original oversight regrettable. You know that the revision does not explain why it was made, because protocol language does not carry the why, only the what. And the why in this case was a cold night and a stone wall and a woman standing still in the dark saying the things that cannot be said out loud. And you know that the most important thing a highly trained security professional did on that shift was recognize, in the 4 seconds before protocol took over, that the most dangerous assumption you can bring into the dark is the certainty that you already know what you are looking at. He did not know, he waited. He watched, he was right. The East Garden at Buckingham Palace is lit differently now on the south end. A maintenance upgrade according to the ground schedule. Better visibility along the wall. Whitfield noticed it on his next night patrol. He stood for a moment at the point in the path where he had stood in October, looked at the newly lit section of old stone, and thought about what light does to a place and what it takes away, and what it cannot touch regardless of how many lumens you add to the south end of a garden that has been holding people's private things since 1762, without being asked to and without, as far as anyone can tell, any plans to stop. Then he completed his patrol, Sector 4, on time by the book. The wall looked the same as it always had. The things that happen on night duty that never make it into the report are not always the things that went wrong. Sometimes they are the things that went exactly right, in a way that the report form was never designed to hold.